This is a recording of one of my articles entitled Should Theories Have a Control Group? It is a commonly held belief that natural selection is a process by which modifications to a type of organism accumulate over time, based on their ability to increase the organism's chances of survival and reproduction. It is also a commonly held belief that an omnipotent God created all life as we know it according to a grand design. However, given the circular nature of metaphysics, I think I'm going to go ahead and postulate a third hypothesis. All of the seemingly random changes that sustain evolution were dictated by God's grand design. However, the God being such a mediocre designer, it ended up such that we can't actually separate his grand design from what would be just random mutations. I find this third theory for the emergence of life to be by far the most spiritually satisfying and in line with all current evidence. Anyway, recently I stumbled upon this paper, which basically shows various state-of-the-art techniques for neural architecture search doing no better than random. It's pretty experimentally thorough as far as machine learning papers go, which is to say, not very, but still better than most. They ran benchmarks on two plate datasets, which are used in a lot of research papers, including many of the neural architecture search papers that they were comparing with. The datasets being PTB, a natural language dataset, and CIFAR-10, an image dataset. Also, they seem to have at least attempted to control for some of the inherent randomness. Quote, we ran 10 experiments with different initialization for the sampling policy. Again, this might not sound like an ideal experiment from which one can draw conclusive statements, but this is the ML literature that we are working with, and as far as I'm concerned, these guys are actually just trying too hard. Also, the Reddit discussion includes a bunch of people citing various papers and personal experiences that have similar claims, but I couldn't be bothered to follow up on those links. The link to that is in the article, so feel free to do some digging yourself if you want. Also, the link to the paper itself is in the article. Regardless, I think that there's a good reason why they are trying so hard in this paper to use the best experimental practices available. Because the claims they are making, if taken at face value, seem to be quite outrageous. The most popular neural architecture search methods, that is DARTS, NAO, NAS, and Bayesian NAS, are no better than searching randomly. Is this quite the same as trying to throw away the work of a few dozens of PhD theses down the drain? Maybe not. They do seem to suggest some ways of addressing the issue, or at least you could say they identify some root causes that could be addressed. But I'm unsure. I'm not an expert in this area, and apparently most expert-built algorithms are outperformed by a coin toss. So, are there even experts in this area now? Maybe there are certain datasets where NAS algorithms do perform better than random. But regardless, I want to use this as an entry point into a broader question. Should we and can we use random controls to confirm the validity of a theory? Theory as search tool. It seems that one of the chiefly roles of scientific theory, when applied to the real world, is very similar to the role of neural architecture search algorithms. It's a tool for limiting search space. Indeed, this can be said of almost any theory other than those modeling things like mathematics and formal logic. In those cases, the theory is basically everything that there is to it. There is no underlying reality being modeled. But for most theories, instead of using them to predict the world without checking, we often predict the results of experiments, then we run those experiments to validate that the results are true. For example, we might predict that theoretically, given 2 centimeters of extra fuselage on our plane, its top speed will go down by 50 kilometers an hour. Its resistance to impact with swallows will increase to 4,788 joules per square meter, and its behavior when encountering crosswinds of speed x will now fall into category y. But usually, at least as far as I've been led to believe, all of those theoretically sound conclusions are thoroughly tested. First by experimenting on the individual components, then on the fuselage as a whole in a wind tunnel, and then by building a few test planes and actually flying them. Granted, I think there are ways of doing research that don't fall under this paradigm, but I think that many do. To put it in a more abstract terms, you have something like 1. Given solution search space S, use theory A in order to pick an ideal solution. 2. Run experiments to validate the ideal solution. 3. If the solution fails, try another theory B or some other variation on theory A and go back to step 1. Rinse and repeat until the experiment succeeds. Or, number 4, if all theory fail, try using experimental data and data from previous experiments to build a new theory. Then go back to step 1. 5. Give up if you've run out of funding. Basically, we have the theory acting upon the search space to find a solution and implicitly an experiment that will help validate that solution. What would a control for this process look like? I'd say something like this. Step 1. Given solution search space S, sample a solution randomly. Step 2. Run experiments to validate the selected solution. Step 3. If the solution fails, go back to step 1 and make sure to sample a non-identical solution. Step 4. Give up when you've run out of funding. The problem here arises as to how you define the search space S. In our airplane example, if we are looking for a solution as to how do we make this more resistant to impact with birds, and the search space includes possible ideas like paint it with tiger stripes or add a cotton candy machine, then we will be sampling arbitrary nonsense forever. In a realistic scenario, S would have to be defined as something like the search space of all easy to implement changes which are based on common sense and have some relationship with the desired outcome. But even that definition might allow for solutions like make the fuselage thicker by 50 centimeters. So I think it's warranted to add another clause, something like, and where the magnitude and range of any given parameter is closely matched to the magnitude and range of that parameter or a very similar parameter as used in other related experiments. Or, less formally, we could say the search space S contains all common sense solutions which can be implemented and tested quickly given the current budget, where common sense is defined as similar to things tried in other experiments aiming at a similar topic, or implying a very small variation from the current setup, or having an obvious possibility of a causal relationship between them and the desired outcome. Regardless of which definition you prefer, I believe that from a high vantage viewpoint, this search space could be defined using simple heuristics in most cases. Would this actually work? So, for the sake of argument, let's assume that whenever a given theory tells us to run a specific experiment, we also run a random control experiment as described above. Can we gain any insight out of this? Well, maybe. It's hard to tell since a lot of experiments have foregone conclusions. There are cases where a theory has close to ideal predictive power. For this method to shine through, you need to specifically select for theories with a lot of edge cases. But if someone was to actually apply this kind of method, that's the kind of theory that they would probably target anyway. I don't think anybody is contesting the accuracy of inorganic chemistry or statics. Also, assuming some degree of common sense, or at least knowledge of all previously related experiments is required to actually determine the search space, who would be tasked with determining it? Wouldn't the experimenters be biased towards making the search space as unreasonably wide as possible in order to defend from the possibility of their theories being just a statistical artifact? Maybe, but this kind of argument could be used to invalidate most scientific research. We have to assume that, on average, the majority of work is done with pure intentions and in good faith. Finally, what should you do assuming that this method actually works? Assuming that you do end up randomly sampling solutions and randomness does about as well as theory. Would anyone act on this? Well, my first instinct is to say that I don't think so. After all, there are fields that are unable to make good predictions about the systems that they pretend to be modeling. See, for example, economy, sociology, and psychology. And that has proven to be no detraction from pursuing research in those fields. Though it might be that a physicist would act with a bit more care than an economist if they heard something like, random people on the streets are able to make forecasts about your object of study as well, if not better, than your theories. So it might be that, if successfully applied in some of the hard sciences, this could actually lead to actionable results. Another interesting idea that stems from playing with this is whether or not certain theories could be immune to being controlled for. Intuitively, it seems that only a bad theory would offer up no possibility of random control, in that the control assumes that there is some search space and some problem. However, if you have a theory where the problem is the theory itself, in other words, you could be looking at data purely to validate and expand the very theory that's being used to dictate the experiments being done to collect the data. In this case, randomly searching would be obviously worse, but also this kind of endeavor to me seems flawed to begin with. So overall, I'm pretty uncertain about this idea. It's one of those things that seems somewhat obvious, actually so obvious that I'm surprised I haven't heard anyone mention it before, at least not in such a broad context. In statistics and in machine learning, controlling against random is a pretty familiar concept. It might be that it only works with an oversimplified definition of theory and experiment, and it couldn't actually be applied to real-world research environments. I don't know. For now, it remains an interesting thought for me. If you know anything more on the topic, especially as it pertains to validating theories in the hard sciences, then do tell me. It might be that a similar idea is already applied and I am just unaware of the name that it goes by.